But let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to cover these topics on the left, and we'll start with absolute and relative references. First, let's start with the basics. So what is a reference? A reference is simply pointing to another cell. So if we wanted to say, whatever's in cell B2, give us that, we can refer to the cell by saying equals B2, or hitting the equal sign and then clicking on the cell that we're trying to reference. So I can go ahead and say equals B6, and it will copy whatever is in this column B. Now I have some formatting on here that's changing the colors just to make it a little bit easier to see the numbers. And if I were to drag this formula down, either using that box there, or I can move down with my shift arrow key and then Control D or Command D on Mac, copy the formula down, or simply copy and paste. You'll notice that it started as B6, and as I move down, it updates the row number. So that's a relative reference where from where it started, it's always pointing one to the left. So as I drag this down and copy it, it'll still point one to the left. If I want to make it an absolute reference, I can say equals, and in this case, I'll point here. Normally it would be F6, and if I copy that down, it still updates. But if I want to make it absolute, I can put a $sign there and copy that down, and it will stay on row 6. So the $sign locks the row number, but I can also lock the column number, and we'll do that in just a moment here. So relative reference will move, an absolute reference will stay still. And then another note is that you can hit the F4 key, and it will toggle through the different locking options. So not locked at all, both row and column, just the row, and just the column. So let's keep it at just the row for now. And then if we were to drag this to the right, you'll notice that it keeps updating the column because the column is not locked. So let's go ahead and update the column now. And if we do just B15 and drag it over to the right, you'll notice that it goes B, C, D, so it's always updating. But if we want to lock in the B, all we have to do is say equals $sign B15. And that way when we drag it, it's going to stay pointing to B. Now, of course, if I were to drag this down, it would keep updating the row because the row is not locked. So if I wanted to always point to the same row and column, I can lock both, and that will stay put where it is. So now let's look at a few different ways that you can copy and paste data, and then I have a few other tips to cover. So you can paste formatting, you can paste values, and you can paste transpose data, which is essentially if you copy a column, you can paste it as a row. So let's go ahead and take a look at those few. So when pasting a formula, I have a formula that's the cell to the left and the cell above it added together. You can just do Control-C for copy, Control-V for paste, or Command-C and Command-V on a Mac. Or you can right-click copy, and you'll notice that it shows you the shortcuts that you have available. So great shortcuts to learn if you're doing something all the time. Keep an eye out for these little clues here as to what the shortcuts are. You might also just want to paste formatting. Let's say you like the color scheme, but you don't want to overwrite your data. If you do a standard paste, it's going to overwrite what you had there. But you can go to Paste Special, so right-click Paste Special and Formatting. Or what you can do is there are shortcuts. So Command-Option-V or Control-Alt-V on Windows. So Command-Option-V on a Mac pulls up this pop-up here, and you can either hit the F key for formulas, V for values, or T for formatting, and then hit Enter. And the alignment is different, but that's just because numbers by default align to the right, whereas letters and text aligns to the left by default. And let's say we just want to paste the values and not the formatting. Again, we can pull up that menu and just go to Values and hit Enter, and now we get A, B, C, D, E. Looks like one of these had central alignment, so we'll move that left. But that way you get the values and not the formatting. And then transpose that I mentioned earlier, you can copy and paste special transpose, and it'll take a column and turn it to a row, or row to column. Now be careful if you have formulas here, this can get a little bit tricky. So let's see what happens here. And got a little bit crazy. So just be careful when doing that. Sometimes if you have numbers and you want to take a column of data and make it a row of data, you'll have to first paste the values and then copy and transpose the data there. So let's go ahead and get rid of this, and let's take a look at a few other shortcuts. So let's say you have a table of data and you want to quickly make a filter. There are a few different ways to do this. You can go to Data Filter. If you're on Windows, you can hit Alt-D-F-F. You can also hit, let's see, I have this down below, Control-Shift-L, or I think it's Command-Shift-L. No, not Command-Shift-L. It's still Control-Shift-L for Mac. And that will add a filter to where you can sort or say only give me some names. So if you're making lots of tables, it's really helpful to learn the shortcut instead of having to go through the menu every time. When you hit the Alt key on a Windows machine, you'll actually get letters up at the top. And then you can follow those letters through and learn the shortcuts that you use all the time. So that's really helpful to do and will make you a lot faster in Excel. Under the View tab, you can freeze panes or open up a new window. So let's say you're looking at two different sheets. You can, well, we'll do freeze pane first. So let's say I want to always see what's above here and always to the left. I can hit freeze pane. And now I always see the first column and I always see the first 25 rows. And I can go back and click unfreeze to do that. Or if I only want to see the top row, I can hit freeze top row, or same thing for the column. So really useful there. And let's say I'm looking at two sheets, and instead of going back and forth, clicking on topics and then back to copy and paste, I can go to this View tab, click New Window, and I now have two windows. So this is Window 2, this is Window 1. I can pop one to the left, one to the right, and now I can have the first sheet over here, the second sheet over here, and I'm working in the same workbook. So if I update it here, you'll see it on the other side. So really useful there as you are working between multiple sheets or need to look at certain data or click on certain cell references. Instead of having to go back and forth through the sheets, you can have them up side by side. So now let's look at defined names and ranges. They are very useful when you start to have more complex workbooks. And what that means, or what that lets you do, is give names to certain cells. So let's say, typically, let's say you're calculating a future value of something. You can use the future value equation, which you'll learn in the finance class, where you enter your rate, the number of periods, and your present value, and you get to your answer. And when you go look at this formula, you see all these different cell references that don't really mean anything unless you go back and look at what is there. So what you can do is you can define names or define ranges or set variable names and say, let's call this 5% cell rate. Let's call this 5 cell periods. And you'll notice that it says the name here. And then PV present value, we've called it present value. And we can also look at the list under Formulas, Name Manager, or Define Name. You can look there, and it will show you all the different variables that you've named. So here I said we have a rate of 4% and 5% depending on the year. And then I can use an if statement, and if I change this year, it will update the rate. So all I did is say if the cell above it is equal to 2019 or equal to 2020, give me the 2020 rate, otherwise give me the 2019 rate. So there's a very basic, if a certain thing happens, give me this, if not, give me something else. And then when I go to make my future value equation, I can, instead of clicking on the cell, or even if I click on the cell, it'll give me the variable name, I can type in the different variable names or just click on the cell. Need an extra rate, periods, payment is 0, so leave that blank, and then present value finally. So hit enter there, and now when I go and look at the formula, I can tell exactly what's going on. So it makes it a lot easier to follow. So it's the difference between, especially if if this were on a different sheet, if we were to place this back on the topic sheet or like the variables sheet, you would have to go look at what's in topics B16 or topics B17 instead of just saying rate 2020 or rate 2019. So a lot easier to follow your formulas there. And then I also just put a bunch of shortcuts to look at. So you can change sheets using shortcut, which in Windows is Control, page up or down. In Mac, it's Option, left and right arrow key. I'm not sure if Windows also uses arrow keys on laptops, but feel free to try it out, see what happens. So it's very easy to go left and right between your sheets. You can also jump to the next break. So what that means is, let's say my cursor, I've selected A52 and I want to get down to here. I can hit Command and then the down arrow, or up or right or left, and it'll jump to the next natural break. So you can see here that it keeps jumping to the next either beginning or end of a section. Wherever there's data or wherever there's a gap, it'll jump over. Very useful. If I want to move down but also select along the way, I just add the Shift key to it. So Control Shift or Command Shift arrow. So very easy to move quickly from the top to the bottom, left to right, etc. Let's see, there's also, there's Shift arrow, just does one at a time, whereas Control Shift or Command Shift goes the whole way. And then the paste special dialog that I mentioned earlier is a really good way to, if you're just pasting values or formatting, a really easy way to pull up that menu there. And then another useful one, a lot of times you'll have a column of numbers and you want to add them up. So let's say you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And instead of typing in sum everything, you can also just hit, in Windows it's Alt equals, in Mac it's Command Shift T, and you get the total for that entire column, and it adds the sum formula for you. So really great shortcut there. And then in general, if there's something that you do a lot in Excel and you're wondering, how do I do this with a shortcut? All you have to do is go to Google and type in Excel shortcut and the thing you're trying to do, and then click on the first link or two to see which one explains it in the most succinct fashion. So I did a little bit of sum formula here. We'll cover that a little bit more in depth on the next sheet. So jumping into it, we have these different regions with units sold, and you'll notice that we have West here a couple times. So let's say we want to total the entire sales. We just say equals sum, and I can either select this here, or I can click and shift down, or Control Shift down, different ways to select it there, or I can use that shortcut, Command Shift T or Control or Alt equals for Windows. But let's say we want to just get totals for a certain region. So we want to say add the numbers if something is true. So for that we can use SumIf, and the range is what I'm checking against. So I want to check these for the word north. If I get the word north, give me the corresponding values to the right, and I'll hit enter. So north has 3. I don't see north anywhere else, so that checks out. But let's say we did west. We can change this to west. Now we get 5 because west has 3 here and 2 there. But what if I copy this formula down, copy, paste, Control C, Control V, or Command C, Command V on Mac, and now I'm getting 2. So something is off. And what happened here is that we didn't do absolute references. So when I click on this, everything has now shifted down 2 cells because I copied a formula and pasted it 2 cells lower. So to prevent that from happening, I would have to change these to absolute references, where the A2 through A6 has to stay the same, the B2 through B6 has to stay the same, and then the A10 stays as a relative reference because it's pointing 1 to the left. So when I copy it down 2 rows, I still want it to point to whatever is left of it. So let me copy and paste that, and now we get the proper 5 that we're expecting. Similarly, instead of summing numbers, you can also count. So region count, count A2 through A6, but we get a 0 for that because this will only count numbers. I think there's a CountA function that lets you count non-blanks. So that's one way of doing it. But really important to remember that it will only count numbers and not words, not letters. So we can try this with column B, and we should get a count of 5 because there are 5 cells within that range. If I change 1 to 0, it stays as 5. If I change it to A, it goes to 4 because, again, it will only count the numbers in there. But let's say we want to count given a certain condition. Similar to SumIf, let's do CountIf. So CountIf, it's in north. So CountIf, this is north. And we get 1 for north. And if I copy paste, something happened. We didn't lock the A4 or the A2 through A6. So let's go ahead and just lock the 2 and the 6. And now I'm getting the proper 2. So be very careful as you copy and paste formulas, understanding and remembering which ones need to be relative references and which ones need to be absolute references. So now let's look at VLookup. VLookup is a really powerful tool, but we're actually going to cover index and match after, which is the preferred method because it's a little bit more flexible. But first, let's look at what VLookup can do. So VLookup lets you look for a certain value in a column and then give you a corresponding value in a column to the right. What it can't do is look back to the left. So let's see this in action. Let's say we want to find James in this table. So we have James as the first name, and we want to look up the last name for James. We can do equals VLookup, and notice here I haven't pointed this out yet, but it actually tells you what parameters come next. So equals VLookup, and in fact I can click on VLookup and it'll give me a full explanation of what the VLookup tool does, a video. So if you haven't used a function before, there's a lot of documentation, or you can just Google how to use it. But really great resources within Excel. So VLookup, the first thing is lookup value. I want to look up James, and I'm going to go ahead and lock that for now. And then where am I looking for James? I'm looking in this table, and notice how the first column that I selected is where the name James is going to be. So for VLookup, you're always looking at the leftmost column, and you're going to find something to the right. And then for the last name, I want not the first column, but the second column in my selection. And then so that it's an exact match on James, and 99% of the time this will be the case, just put false there. And notice how it gives me Anderson because it found James and it said what's in the second column, we get Anderson. So if I copy this down, salary, Anderson, why is it doing that? Well, I told it to look in the second column, but salary is in the third column. So we will have to change from column 2 to column 3. And also I need to be careful because this red box shifted down because I did not lock this table here. So I'm going to lock those rows, copy it down, and then change this to a 3. And then what we can't do is figure out the ID from the name lookup because that's to the left. So for that, we're going to use index and match, which is just on the next sheet here. So match will give you where an item is within the list. So we see that James is the second person in the list here. So it's Emily, then James. We can also see that it's the fourth row on this sheet. So first we want to say, okay, if we're trying to find information for James, we need to figure out where James is. So we can say we want to match, and I'm putting James in quotes because James is a string. It's a bunch of characters. Otherwise, it'll try to look for a variable named James, and that doesn't exist. So any strings will have to be put into quotes. And we're looking that up in this list of names. And similar to VLookup, you're almost always going to put a 0 here. That's for an exact match. Otherwise, it'll give you a value that's, I think the first one that matches that's bigger or smaller. But that's rarely used, and it's usually going to be an exact match that you need to look up. So when we do that, we see that James is in the second row. We can do the same thing for Mia, but instead let's actually do the entire column. So let's match looking for Mia, and I'm just going to select column C. So instead of giving me a 3, it's actually going to give me the row number because it's first one that it looks at, second one, third, fourth, and fifth. Because I said let's look at the entire column of C and not just this selected area. And then we can combine match with index, which says give me the first, second, or third item in this list. So if we have position 2, for James, we can say give me in the list of names the position that we found using the match function, and I'm going to get James, and same thing I can do index, and this time I'm actually going to select 2 columns. I could just select the last column, or I could select the entire thing and say, okay, I want the second row, but I also want the second column here. So give me the second column of the selected data in blue, and I get the last name. So we can also use this to look up an ID. So just like we did above, we're going to match the name James in this table, and we want an exact match. So now let's get the ID for James. So I'm going to select the corresponding column, and the row is going to be whatever we had here, and we don't need column number there. So ID 66. So James is row 2, ID 66. If I wanted Jessica instead, it would be row 5, ID 53. So if you're ever looking up data from a table and you just need a few data points, or you have a drop down, you can also restrict this. So under data, let's see, where is this one? Data validation. You can go to a list and say, I want to only be able to select these names. And when you do that, you actually get a drop down of options. And then it's easy to select the name, and it will automatically update the row, the ID, or whatever you end up doing. And then once you do this, if you don't want to have a bunch of different lines, you can combine it into one function. So give me, I'm going to want the ID column eventually. But which row do I want? Well, I need to match on whatever name we've selected from the names column, and give me an exact match. And I get the ID using just one line. So the thing to be careful with is that match will only return the first instance of that name. So if you have 2 Jameses or 2 Johns, once it finds the first one, it'll stop there and give you whatever is in that, or it'll tell you that row number instead. If I try to search for something that doesn't exist, if I search for Evan in this list, I get an error. But what you can do to make it a little bit prettier than that is IfError, and then I just paste it in the exact formula that I used above. And then if I get an error, I can say no match. Let's see what I did here. Oh, there should not be an equal sign there. One equal sign to start your formulas. So IfError match, which gives us an NA error. Instead of showing the error, just say no match. So now let's look at index and match, but this time using named ranges. So I'm going to take this table and give it a name, call it my table. And let's say I want to search by the last name. I want to look for the name Clark and get back the ID. So just like last time, we could do match to figure out what column we're in, but this time we want to match the search column and this list here, and we want an exact match. So last is the third, but let's do that with a named range now. We can say, actually before I do it here, I'm going to say if we take the index of my table and give me the first row only, and I'm going to leave the column blank. I do need the comma here. Sorry, I do need the comma. I can't just end it here. I need the comma and then a blank there. I can click enter, and it shows the first row of my table. So I'm going to use that, and I'm going to search for the name, or for the word last, and hopefully it gives me back the third column there. So let's go ahead And instead of selecting the row, just know that I want my table, the first row, and I put a 0 instead of a blank for the entire, for every single column. So when I do that, I get 3, and if I change this to first, I get a 2, ID is 1, so that checks out. So what I can do is I can now take this formula and I can define a name, and I can call it my column, and it's referencing C11, and then doing exactly what we just did. So now I can type in my column, and I'm getting an NA. So what happened here? Well, it looks like the difference in position between here and there is the same difference in position as this blue square and the ID. So what I need to do in my formula here is, we'll go to name manager, my column is, right now it's pointing at G10. This should always point to C11. So I'm going to make this an absolute reference instead of a relative reference. And now it should work. So wherever I put my column will work. So I can do the same thing with the row. We need to figure out which row Clark is in, and we need to look in this column. Well, actually, no, ID. Let's change this back to last. So we're looking for Clark is the last name. So I can say match. I need to look up the name Clark. I'm looking in column 3. So I need to get the index. I need to use index to get my table. I want every single row from column 3, which we've called my column. And I need to make that an exact match. So I'm going to add a comma 0 at the end just to be safe. So great, good so far. But I'm actually going to go ahead and call this my row. And name manager new, my row. Except this time I'm going to be smart and lock in that C12 reference. And then what I can do here is say index. So my table, I want my row and my column, and it will give me, which row is Clark? I want to get back ID. Sorry, I should really be looking up the first column. So column 1. So ID 14 for Clark. So if I instead wanted to do first name Jessica, we're going to get ID 53 because that's in column 2, row 6. And the fact that my row and my column are defined, I actually don't need this information here because this is referencing a defined name or a range that's already been defined. And they exist here. So if you wanted to keep a really clean table or sheet, I could actually delete these rows and have all of those formulas behind the scenes. So it makes it very flexible. And what I should do, instead of, I'll leave this here, but instead of hard coding this column 1, what I really should do is say match what we're looking up. So match that through, and it's going to be that header row, which is index of my table, comma 1. So if I change this to salary, now it'll automatically adjust and look up, it'll look up first name, Jessica, which tells me it's in row 6, and then looks up salary. And I can go ahead and if I really wanted to make this a variable, call it salary. And it looks like it may have already filled this. Nope, did not fill it in for me. It just referenced that one cell, but really I want it to be this formula. So now I can type in salary, use it as a variable anywhere, and it will be controlled by these parameters. So if I looked up last name, Smith, and I want first name, we get Emily Smith. And again, I could go ahead and delete these. And this is all being done behind the scenes. And actually I can put salary here. So this just is salary based on last, Smith, and then looking up salary. And if you needed to go update these formulas, you can find them here. But that's a really clever way to have complex formulas nested in one another and then keep them behind the scenes so that it doesn't make your sheet messy, but you can still do those complex formulas. If and IfError are both really useful functions, and they're actually both pretty easy to use. So let's say we have this information and we want to determine if somebody has a high salary. We're saying that a high salary is anything 4,500 and up, and we want to essentially tag these as yes or no. So what we can do is we can say if the salary here is greater than or equal to whatever's in B1, and I'm going to make that an absolute reference so the B1 doesn't move, but the salary will move down with the formula. If that is true, I'll put yes, and if it's not true, I'll put no, and notice how these are in quotes. And that way it'll highlight everybody who does match the criteria. And if we change the criteria, if we make it 5,000, Richard drops off. But very easy way to just do a simple logic. You could say if, and if you wanted to do multiple, if that's greater than this, and then ID is greater than, call it 50, then yes or no. So high salary and ID greater than 50. So we lost a couple folks there. We lost Richard because I did greater than, not greater than or equal to. So let's greater than or equal to. Now we get the yes down there. But we lost John because even though he has a high salary, his ID is 30. So it did not meet both criteria of salary being high and ID being above 50. So we can do the same thing down here. If whatever's to the left equals 0, no, or yes. And I added conditional formatting. And then finally, the IfError. Let's say we are calculating revenue per unit. So we take, I don't know why that's a $sign. Let's fix that. So if we have $100 over 10 units, we get $10 per unit. But if we haven't sold any, we have 0, and we get this ugly divided by 0 error. So all we have to do is we take our formula, and I'm going to type IfError, and then go to the end, put a comma, and you can just leave it blank is what I typically do. And that way when I copy my formula down, it just has a blank cell here. Or if you wanted to put a message, you could say no sales, and then it will show no sales. But that might mess up some formulas later if you're only expecting numbers within this column. So really useful IfError, especially if you know that you're going to have certain rows that throw errors on you. Concatenate is also a really useful function. Essentially, it's joining multiple strings or multiple words. So let's say we wanted to have a combined name instead of first name and then last name. We want them together. I can say concatenate that and here, but if I do that, there's no space in between. So all I have to do is put another text in the middle and add quotes there. And I can copy that down. And it's combining Richard and Lopez, Mark and Reed. And then you can also use the and symbol. So I can say, give me C14 and I need a space and Smith. So these do the exact same thing, but some people like one, some people like the other. If you wanted to put something in quotes, this is a little bit weird, but all you have to do is 4 quotation marks at the beginning and the end, and then it'll give you quotes. And then finally, I'd like to cover string manipulation. So if you have a long string, let's say you have addresses, you might have to say, get all the street numbers or all the zip codes. So there are a few ways you can go about that. And then there's also a cool feature that's text to columns. So under the data tab, there's this text to columns button. And if you click that, you can say, I want to split it at every comma, for example. So I'll click delimited and say split it every comma. And when I click finish, it splits it up into 3 columns. The downside of this is that if you ever bring in new data, you're going to have to go through that same text to columns process. Whereas if you use formulas and you bring in new data, it'll automatically do it for you. So let's go ahead and do that. So this is going to require a few steps. Typically extra columns are helpful. So first I want to say, where's the first comma? And we're going to adjust from there. So I want to find a comma, and I'm putting this in quotes, within A5. And I'm starting at the very beginning so I can leave the final parameter blank. So that's going to be a 17, 17, and 23, because there's an apartment number here. But now let's say we want everything to the left of the comma. So I can do left here, and I need 17 characters. That includes the comma, so I'm actually going to say 17 minus 1. And again, that gets me everything before the comma for each of these roads, or each of these addresses. Now we want the street number, so everything to the left of the first space. Now this works as long as you don't have a 3801 space B, but hopefully you'll either have scrubbed your data before or you adjust based on that possibility. So we want left of whatever's in here now, and we want to find wherever the first space is within here. And just like before, we have to subtract 1 from there so that we don't include the space. And then for the street name, we can say everything to the right of that first space. So everything to the right, or what I did up above here is I said, taking away the length of, let's see, the length of this minus the length of that. So if this is 20 character, I guess 16 characters minus 4 characters minus 1, give me the right 11 characters. Or I could say to the right of wherever the first comma is, but then I have to do the total length of the string minus the commas, which is what I've already done here. So all we really have to do is say we want the full length minus whatever the street number was, minus 1. And now we get East Side Street. Great. If we have a unit number, so if we get an error when we try to, actually I'll start find the pound sign within here, and I get an error for these two because there is no pound sign. So if error, I'm going to leave it blank. And then actually I'm going to freeze panes here so you can always see where we started. So if that is not equal to, that's the double caret there, is not equal to blank, then I want everything to the left of, so from the left side, how many characters do I want? Wherever the pound sign is. That's going to give me everything leading up to that number, up to the apartment number. And if there isn't, then I can just give me whatever's in column E. So if there is no number, I can just take the original. Great. I will have to subtract another 2 here. So left of F5 minus 2 to get rid of that. And then for the apartment number, I can say, I'm going to use the mid function, which starts in the middle, and I can tell it how many characters. And I just use this giant number 9999 so that it will go far enough to the right. If I put 5 and I had something that was 10 digits or 10 characters in, it would cut off midway. So if if we need to do something there. So if we do have a number, give me the middle, start in the middle here, and we're starting at wherever we found that, but we have to move forward one character, and give me the rest of it. So there's nothing here, but there is in the final one. And then it looks like I have to, let's see, trim, right, A3. Okay, so now I want everything to the right of the comma. So we got everything to the left of the comma. So now we're going to get Houston, Texas, 77098. So to the right of the comma, that's going to be right of A3. And it's A5. And we're subtracting the length that is, let's see. Yeah, this should all be 5, 5, and 5. So without the trim, if I do the right of A5, length of A5 minus B5, which is where we first found the comma, we get that. And notice there's a little space up front, so all I have to do is put a trim around that. It'll remove any leading or trailing spaces. And we can go through the same process. Left of, let's see, F3 is, oh, sorry, this should be, to get the city, there should be I5. So within here, we want the left certain number of characters, and we want to find, in this case, the comma, everything before the comma, within this here. And if we do that, we get Houston, comma. So there should be a comma in here. And if I do -1, that takes care of it. Now I need the state. So now I'm starting. And again, this should be so we're going to find, or since we already got this, we can just say, there are multiple ways to do this. You can either find the comma and then move over one to the right, or you can say we've already taken off the left chunk of it. So we're going to start in the middle of this, but how far do we start in? Well, we start however far the city takes up, and then we have to add comma, space, and then the first letter, so it's 3 over. And we know the state is going to be 2 characters, so we just put a 2. And then finally the zip, we can just say that's the right side of this, 5 characters. So did a lot of work there. But those are just different ways you could break down and split up strings. And then just to illustrate that trim a little bit more, this here, if we look at the length of it, we see that it's 57 characters, but there is a space at the front and the back, so we can trim this. And now if we look at the length, it's only 55. So I hope this is all helpful. I know we covered a lot of ground, but I think it's useful just to see what sorts of features are in Excel. And then if you want to dig a little bit deeper into any of these, you can go ahead and Google how to blank in Excel, or feel free to leave comments on the video, and I'd be happy to cover other topics as well.